number 142, Structure and Process in Creativity. Today, we're going to be talking about how do you create a structure for your own creative process that reveals you to you and that reveals you in your music, your art form, your words, and your actions in the world. I'm Kathleen Wiley, a Jungian psychoanalyst in North Carolina, and I am here with Deborah Henson-Conant, a creative, a mentor, a composer, an artist, and we both play the harp, and that's why we call this Jung at Harp. So, DHC, would you like to kick us off here in talking about structure and process?
Sure. Yeah. So in Hip Harp Academy, which is my academy where I'm teaching, this is the quarter of creative resonance. And creative resonance is founded on the 7 principles of that I call the strings of passion. There are 7 principles that take you from impulse to creative expression. And they are a process and they create structure. And the second string, last week we talked about the first string, or 2 weeks ago, the string of impulse, which is where things start. And then the second string of passion, the string of principle of creative expression, is structure. And as we started talking about this, we began to talk about something we talk about a lot, which is containers. So containers for this and containers for that. And then I got really interested in thinking, wow, there are actually, I'm always talking about the structures to help you be creative, the internal flexible structure that's like our skeleton, so that you have something very simple to start with so that you can make as much creative, you can be as creative as you want with something, just like nature is creative with us. Each of us have a skeleton, and by us, I mean us, my cat, the squirrels outside. We all have a internal flexible structure that's somewhat similar, and yet that allows us to be very, 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 very different in terms of our expression. But then I started thinking about what are the structures that I'm not conscious of that are holding in place some of the things that are constraining me. And then we started talking about unconscious and conscious. And you started saying some very interesting things about what Jung had said about what happens when we bring something into consciousness. And I was saying something like, well, we bring the structure in, and you were like, no, 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 no. It does not have structure in the unconscious. And I realized that when I am teaching, I am bringing, like, let's say I'm teaching a song like The Nightingale. So, and this is something, who will sing for the nightingale? So people are hearing it as a song, and they're hearing, okay, there's a melody, and then there's a, but maybe they hear the melody. And when I'm teaching it, I'm teaching this is not a series of notes that you need to play correctly. This is G. It is the notes of G, in a particular, they happen to be like this. They're opened up. It's called open position chord. And then you're rocking on the top. But for the function of the song of the Nightingale to happen, you do not need all of that. You could do, or you could just do the lowest note for the function of the song to move forward. And most of the time when I'm teaching that song or teaching anything, people have no idea how to break that down. It's all this mush. This is all the stuff you have to do right. And it's when I break it down that then they're like, oh, I see. That's all the same thing. And the thing that fascinates me is that at the end of a half an hour session or hour session, people have no more strength and they have no more years of playing, and yet they are able to engage creatively and play with a sense of mastery. It seems to be simply by understanding how to break this down. So simply understanding the structure and what's important and what isn't important is making all the difference in something that appears to be happening with their hands. Explain me that.
Well, I'm having lots of different thoughts there.
Okay.
Part of what got us on this topic today, of course, we were planning on talking about structure, is really trying to understand what clicks in place when you say this is a G chord. It's and that you're rocking, and that what matters here is the G. It's not everything else. It's not the embellishment, but it's the G. It's like going to the root. And so I'm thinking about how having that understanding is taking people from like the top step, which is the
Mhm.
most outer one, to the
Mhm.
deepest. Like, what's the fundamental? What's the essence? We talk about
Right.
that a lot. The
Right.
essence of it. And so it's interesting because you've illustrated a process of
Right.
this root coming up into an outer expression that's a much more complicated structure, the one,
Mm.
5, 10, the rocking back and forth, than just the picking up of the G chord. But it's not really more complicated. It's just a higher expression, higher not being better, but higher just being,
It, it,
or
it
we could say a deeper. We could take it either way, expression of the same thing. Um, so in a way, you don't have a process without a structure, and inherent in every structure is a process. Um,
Ooh, I
because
oh, I wanna talk more about that. But
yeah,
as you were talking, I realized that I was like, "Well, what's important here is the G because that's what moves the harmony." And as you were talking, I was like, "Well, that's what's important to me because 'cause I'm a composer. So I don't really care if you play this with one hand or two hands or you play it or you play I mean, like, it's just a different thing." But I realized that if in the hands of like some conservatory harpist who was teaching, they might say, well, what's important is the tone,
right.
and what's important is the fact that this is created in such a way that each of the notes reinforces the harmonics of the note below it,
Mhm.
like I suddenly realized that I was claiming the only thing that's important in music is the composition.
But I think this goes back to why we were wanting to talk about this also, is that each of us, our creative process is going to be rooted in something that speaks to the essence of our self-expression, and that the structure then that we're going to need to move in the world is going to be specific to each of us. Jung says our psyche, all of our psyches has a generic manual, just like our skeleton. We can go to the anatomy book and we get what our skeleton looks like, but each of our skeletons also is slightly different. It gets fleshed out, it gets formed in a different way. So your aha just was a beautiful illustration. A part of what I wanted to emphasize today is which, even though the structures, we all may have similar structures, our process is also going to have unique qualities to who we are and what is most important to us. Just like you said, you're a composer, so it is the harmonic progression. It's that
Right.
G that moves the song along, but someone else may see themselves in a different structure. Composer is a structure.
Right, and as you're
Yeah.
saying that, I'm thinking if the end result is artistic expression, I'm
Mm-hmm.
approaching it from a structure a harmonic structure or compositional structural standpoint, and I'm teaching people how to understand how to break apart any composition so that you can make your own version of it and so that you can
Mm-hmm.
break it apart and use only the parts that you really can play, blah blah blah. But I'm thinking someone in one of the classes had the opportunity to work with a someone who was just working with technique, and she came back and she said, well, I discovered that if I just change my relationship to the instrument, suddenly I can play more easily.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, it was the process of realigning physically to the
Mhm.
instrument that gave her
Mhm.
a greater sense of freedom of expression. So the ultimate goal here is for people to have freedom of expression.
Right.
And what's particularly interesting about, the people that I'm working with is they're all adults. They
Mhm.
all have either come from a conservatory background and got stuck in it and got, just couldn't deal with it anymore, or they're people who started the harp at a later part of life after
Mhm.
being an expert at something else. And so my job is to open up from my composer's standpoint. So I'm
Mm.
thinking that each teacher is going to have it not the best way of doing it, but they're going to have their, and that's why it's so beautiful to study with different teachers. You can
Right.
see what are they unlocking and what is this person, each one is unlocking a different door.
Right. That's
Okay,
right.
now why am I talking about unlocking? We're talking about structure.
Well, because when energies move from the unconscious to consciousness, there is a door that's unlocked in our ability to co-create with the energy. When it's in the unconscious, it's going to do its own thing. So when something comes into consciousness, we then can dance with it. We can co-create. We can engage with it and well, we can just engage with it in an effective way.
I love that. I mean, I love that because Valentine's Day is coming up and I'm thinking, wow, what if somebody came out of my unconscious and started dancing with me? How amazing would that be? And then I was starting to think like before they came out of my unconscious, how could they engage with me? Only through affecting my behavior.
And mood.
Oh, okay. All right.
Mood.
Okay.
Yeah. 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 Often the inner world shows up through our moodiness, through our discomfort in our bodies, through through anxieties, through feeling states we quote don't want that we label negative. So the unconscious, and it's not that what's in the unconscious is in any way negative, but that's just what it tends to get our attention, unfortunately. Our
Oh.
ego, our consciousness, whoops, kind of goes along. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
we kind of
Uh-huh.
go along until something makes us stumble, and then when we stumble we say, okay, what happened? And so that calls our attention to the unconscious. So it's not that what's in the unconscious is in any way negative, but it does show up often in quote negative ways when we ignore it. And because, again, that tends to be the only way it will get our attention.
So that's interesting to me vis-a-vis structure in music and
Mhm.
structure in specific because I'm teaching people how to use structure. And this is the week we're talking about it, how to use structure to free themselves. So what I'm hearing you say is until we actually see the structure and can dance with it and can engage with it, we might stumble over the fact that we don't see it. Like someone might start playing a piece and stumble over. Like last night, I was I was having trouble reading music because I always have trouble with that. So I was like, well, forget it. Close my eyes, memorize the shapes. And when I was just memorizing the shapes, I was fine. Although I was trying to think like, how am I going to write those shapes down so that I can remember them tomorrow? And I'm nervous. But now we're talking about process, taking something out of our unconscious, moving it into conscious. So these shapes are kind of in my unconscious. All right. So how do we
Well,
how do we do that? I mean, I know that that's what we're engaged in. That's what I'm engaged in the academy is bringing out those structures so people have them to work with, and they might even have a list of them. Someone was asking, how do I improvise in a yoga class? I
mm,
just doing the same thing, and I was like, well, let's talk about that. You're going to make a repertoire. You're going to create a repertoire, and you can create a repertoire of improv. And on one side, you have what is the thing you're improvising on, and then on the other hand, like it could be this again. It could be something as simple as that. That's what you're improvising on. But then what are all the things you're bringing into it? You're bringing into the fact that you could move it up here. You're bringing into it the fact that you could move it down, you could start playing with it. You're just bringing in all the different ways you could play with that.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we forget. So having a list of those two things, suddenly you've got, now you can start playing.
Yeah, there are a couple of things I wrote down there, but play is so important. So I want to start there. And the psychoanalyst Winnicott talked a lot about play and how important play is. And not necessarily as child's play, but child's play in the sense that we're open, that are willing to experiment, that we don't get hung up when something doesn't work. We just try something different. And that we have this attitude of creativity and discovery and adventure instead of right and wrong and should or shouldn't, that this is, so I think a playful attitude, whether it's in our personal life around our own, being playful with the moods that show up we don't want, or the accidents that happen that show up, or being playful in the sense of, okay, I know how to do chord inversion. So now how do I play with that to improvise, for instance? You had, before that, you said something about using structure to free yourself. And I was, gosh, there's so many things to think about, because it's the paradox. And is the tension of the opposites, that in order to have freedom, we also have to have limitations, that in order to have creative expression, we have to have a skeleton structure, that that structure and process truly are a pair of opposites that go together. I think of process as being more free-flowing energy, things moving along, structure as giving a certain form. And that in truth, if a structure is a form that doesn't allow for process, for free flowing energy, it becomes way too restrictive, as you referenced, for people who are often classically trained and have to stick just to the page. Whereas with the process, there's also got to be a structure. I'm thinking about my husband, who is a folk musician, and he's working right now on with the college where he's an adjunct to do the Bright Star musical, Steve Martin's Bright Star musical, which has a lot of banjo and a lot of fiddles. So it's going to be also with the symphony orchestra. But he got the orchestral music, and it's just like in this total language that he can read, but it's not his primary language. His primary language is banjo tablature. So I've been watching him over the last few weeks learn the songs and then create his own. He calls them tune heads, where he does it in his primary language as the prompt. And so I think that I share that because there's a structure he was given, the orchestral music, that is not at all the way his process flows out in the most enlivening way. He can work with it, but why work with it if his process has another structure that just freely opens up the flow? And so part of what I think you're doing, and I experience with you in HARP Academy, is I learned these structures or snippets, or even like this morning, just the idea that the opening of the nightingale is a G, a 1-5-10, and then you rock at the top. It's like, oh, I can do that. I can now play the first phrase. But there's something about the structure having to also be congruent with one's own process, and letting ourselves play to discover what is that for us, what is that for each of us individually.
I'm as you're talking, I keep thinking about a string further down, which is the string of practice, and practice says, and just before that is the string of roles. So roles is kind of taking apart, like just what I did. This is the role of the bass. This takes the role of the accompaniment. And then I can never get this melody. Yeah, that's why it's hard to sing. Anyway, so this is a melody. Each of them lives independently. You could do that. And you're still playing the song. You could also do this independently. Or whatever it is. And the cool thing is, if you give them independence, then this, just that alone, the first two phrases could become something to improvise.
Right.
And it helps to know this is a melody. It's free. Once this gets freed from how it's all stuck together, then this, I don't know, somehow they get, but, and yet, what's like, it's almost like if glue is, I don't know how to describe this, but most people seem to see music as these things are not take apartable. And it reminds me of the toys that I keep going back to, the toys that I had as a kid, and the toys that were where the manufacturer had done a lot of construction on the toy was much less interesting to me than the toy that was completely open to reinvention.
Legos came to mind, how you could take the same blocks in Lego and make so many different things out of it.
Correct. Although Legos was actually one step too constrained for me. Just like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if I was given rocks or something, like that was like something to actually play with, or I liked machines, so that was fun. Yeah. And being able to take machines apart was really interesting to me. That's why
it's a side of you I don't know.
Oh, but you do. It's one of the reasons I play the harp. The harp is a machine taken apart. I mean, it's a piano with everything revealed.
Right. And of course, you searched until you got the DHC light constructed, so you deconstructed the orchestral harp into that.
Exactly. And in order to deconstruct it means looking at from a different way, getting out of the idea even that this is a harp, but being able to see this is a kind of a shape, a triangular shape with strings on it. And then that's when I was able to think like, well, wait, what else is like that? Well, a bicycle frame. So how can you then, so that kind of deconstruction, I mean, that's later in the Strings of Passion. We're on structure right now, but deconstruction and structure is two parts of the same thing. I'm really fascinated with this idea of process and how we each do need our own process. It's almost like process is a structure that is time through time. And how is process, I mean, I think the Strings of Passion is a process in itself that combines all these things: structure, impulse, roles, deconstruction, practices and practicing. Where does I know it's shooting ahead to a new string. Practices with structure, does that equal process?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me think about it for a minute. Does practices with process equal
structure with practices, does that equal process, or is it relevant?
Well, it's a kind of structure. I mean, it's a kind of process, right? I mean, because if you have a practice where
you can have a structure to your practice. Okay, go on.
Yeah. So it is a process. I couldn't help but think before you mentioned deconstruction, I was also thinking deconstruction. That in some ways, part of what seems relevant to the conversation today is that for me to have the structure I need today, I have to be able to deconstruct my idea of what my day is supposed to look like, to tap into the process of my own flow of psychic energy around these things, to find the specific nuances of the structure I need today.
Okay, can you say that again?
I'll try.
Yeah, okay.
In order to have the structure I need to move through my day. So I have a structure, I have my appointment book, But for me to really be able to show up in my process, I've got to be willing to deconstruct, let go of the ideas of how it should happen, the rigidity around the schedule, the time, the appointments, blah, 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 and tune into my process like, oh, okay, I need 5 minutes extra here, or I need to slow this down a little bit, or in order that my process can then shape the structure of the day. So it just occurred to me how to live out of the structure of who I am as Kathleen, or who I, Kathleen, am as a harpist, or who I, Kathleen, am as an analyst. I have to always be deconstructing on some level, letting go of my ego ideal of what that's supposed to look like in order to be experiencing my own process, to play with the energies that are stirring the process that's happening, so that then can then take shape, and the structure, the form, the words, the practices, the expression I have in this moment.
As you're speaking, I don't know why, I'm thinking of when I was a kid, the first many, there were a lot of people, like the postmistress had a wooden leg, and people were missing limbs. And I mean, I don't know if it's coming out of World War II or what, but so I was seeing and learning about people who were doing everyday things fine, but they didn't have all the normal parts, or whatever you want to call it. And I think that also, and it was fine because
Mm-hmm.
there was something else that was taking that place, that was
Mm-hmm.
providing. If something was needed, it was provided. If a leg was needed, a leg type thing was provided. If you were missing fingers and you were playing the piano, it wasn't needed. There was nothing they didn't
Mm-hmm.
need more fingers.
Mm-hmm.
It was just they were playing with that many fingers, and that was it. So I think as you're speaking, I'm thinking, I kept thinking about the internal structure and what happens when it breaks, or when it, what we do. What do we actually need to add on if something breaks, and what we don't? Sorry, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I mean, one of the reasons why it was so important to me to get a harp that I could play that didn't have pedals was that it occurred to me very young that I might not go through life having all four limbs available.
Oh.
I mean, that seemed like
Mm-hmm.
a lot to expect. And so if I had an instrument where I was in trouble, if I couldn't use my feet, that was, I don't know, it was like courting trouble. So at least be able to play an instrument where, if I was paralyzed from the waist down, doesn't
Mm-hmm.
stop me,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter, doesn't get in the way. So I don't know what this has to do with structure, but I think it does have to do with structure in the sense of creative expression. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what do you actually need for creative expression? And the structure of music, and the music itself, is so powerful that that's the thing that needs to be expressed. It's irrelevant what your body is like. It's irrelevant, whether you have 5 fingers or 2 fingers on a hand, for creative expression. And I don't know why there's something here, and I know we're coming to the end, and yet there's something here for me that's
Uh-huh.
meaningful, that there's something about the structure that makes it so that what's coming into it has no need to be a certain way. Like, every single person is complete coming into this structure, because you can be expressive on the other side of the structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, the harp itself is like that, in the sense that it is a resonating body. So whether you have, 5 fingers, or whether you have 2 fingers, there is plenty you can do to
Mm-hmm.
be to make beautiful music on this instrument. You're going to be creative in different ways, but you come into it with whatever it is and whoever you are and whatever you have. And then it allows you to play and find the way to let that thing, whoever you are, be expressed.
Mm-hmm. Well, but part of what came to my mind as you were saying all of that is that we have to have a structure that helps us feel safe, where we feel contained and safe. for self-expression. And I also had this image, this just as so we're each like a harp, right? So
Yes.
each of the harp, and we're also the harpist,
Well, that's what
Um,
that's what I came to. That's why the program is now called Creative Resonance,
yeah,
because I discovered that as you apply this process of the strings of passion, what happens is, yes, you become the thing that you are doing,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it begins
Um,
to express you in a much more fundamental way.
yeah. So, as we're moving towards the end, I want to say, so for me and the work that I do as a psychoanalyst, is that the structure is one's own psyche. It is the totality of all of the life processes that make up a single individual.
So, oh, our psyche is a harp too.
We could look at it that way if we want.
Well,
I
it's a
mean,
resonating, okay, all
it's
right.
definitely resonating, and we could look if we wanted to play with Jung's model of psyche, that the bass strings are like the deepest layers of the unconscious, that they're just kind of like this deep reverb that's always there. And as you move on up, by the time something gets into ego consciousness and a persona, a role we're putting on, it's all up here, and it's but that it's all interconnected and it's all always resonating. It resonates simultaneously, just like we know if you pluck an upper string, it's resonating in the lower
Right,
register on the harp. The
right.
same is true with our psyches. Whatever's going on up here in our persona is also going on in the is resonating in the
That's
unconscious.
true, although this is not gonna resonate as much in the bottom
Mm-hmm.
as this is gonna resonate in the top, just
Uh-huh.
because this contains literally that pitch.
Yeah.
And does that go with our psyche as well? That
Yeah.
whatever is deep down there, it is going to resonate through who we okay.
It's going to resonate through who we
Mm.
are. And yet, sometimes, particularly when we get into adaptive personas, and that are we put on air,
Oh,
so to
oh,
speak,
oh,
instead
oh,
of being
okay.
in our root, just like the
Okay.
upper strings on the harp, it doesn't resonate nearly as much in our depths because it's not our roots.
I see if that root isn't there. Interesting.
Yeah, so it doesn't have nearly as much substance or staying power.
I'm just gonna check the time here. I know we're
Yeah.
coming to the wow. Well, Kathleen, I just feel like, again, we've gone on an adventure here, and I don't know if we explained this in the beginning that, this is a conversation, that
Mhm.
we are coming here to inquire together about something, that at the beginning we're like, "Hey, what would you like to explore together today?" And
Mhm.
this is what and we also decided to pick a series of ideas because they're in a series in this creative resonance project. This has a lot for me to think about. And some of the
Mhm.
things that opened up for me today are what I've always thought, that there's some kind of, in whatever I'm doing, there's an internal version of it. If I'm really doing it authentically,
Mhm.
there's an internal version of it. But I had never thought about it also in my head or in
Mhm.
my psyche. And I get that my body and my psyche are like, it's all intertwined, but I'm getting an even more powerful sense. And it's answering a question that I've been asking for decades, which is,
Mhm.
why do I play the harp? It always baffled me because it doesn't have the harmonic vocabulary as easily as
Mhm.
what I grew up playing. And yet, as we talked about this, as we talked about the metaphor that it is for
Mhm.
creative expression and body, mind, and spirit and resonance, I'm beginning to realize what an incredible partner it has been in
Mhm.
this journey of
Yeah.
discovery of life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah.
And, and this conversation, now it's more distinct for me.
Mhm.
Like I
Mhm.
literally am feeling that. That
Mhm.
is both wonderful and weird. It was there before. What was there before, but now I'm feeling it, and I didn't before this conversation.
Right. Yeah, it's come into consciousness in a way now that you can connect to it in a different, a more seen way, a more full way than before. Yeah.
So if you were going to take the analogy you were talking about the melody, I would say I can now hear the melodic line of it. I can see the shape
Mhm.
of it. I can.
Mhm. Yeah.
Wow.
So part of what I'm going to take away from today is energetics. I'm always talking in analysis, and particularly with therapists I'm working with who are becoming analysts, is to track what is the psychic energy doing. And your image again of the G chord, the 1 5 10, and then you're just rocking at the top. That's such an energetic picture. It isn't about the note, it isn't about the structure, although all of that is inherent in it. But you gave me a picture, a felt sense of the movement of the energy. And that for me is how I move in my own life is tending the energetics, the movement of the energy. And I'm going to now, when I go to my harp, start there instead of,
Oh, from the notes or something.
yeah, yeah.
And I'm going to take that idea into my concert tomorrow night and
Ooh,
really think about that everything that I'm doing is actually playing with energy.
yes, yes.
Wow. Well, Kathleen, thank you. And thank you everybody for watching these and the amazing comments that I get from people
Mhm.
who, whether you're here or whether you're, watching it later, it's just wonderful to be able to have this conversation. And there's a certain focus that happens knowing that it's kind of going out into the world and hoping that it opens up the possibility of people playing together with ideas just by starting with a starting point of let's discover this together. Let's explore this together. Kathleen, thank you so much for spelunking with me down in the caves of our minds. And thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next week.